Now then, happy to say we are joined in studio by a man who once upon a time, very recently employed in these parts. Dermot Gilleece, you're very welcome to Talbot Street. I'm in your neck of the woods here.
Thank you, Joe.
You have written a book, Farewell to the Fairways. So I was saying to the team outside, it is remarkable the breadth of your career, to state the obvious. But in that you retired last year from the Sunday Independent 2023, I was saying, like, Dermot was a journalist, not born. He was a journalist in the year of the Munich air disaster. And he worked until last year as a journalist. And this year he has brought out Farewell to the Fairways.
Yeah, the indefinite article is important, Joe. A farewell.
A farewell.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Precision is important.
No, it's just my publisher actually insisted that A should go in there. I don't know why, but anyway, he liked the ring of it.
58 to 2023, that is some stint. So the Sunday Independent most recently, 02 to 23. Irish Times, 81 to 02. They're 2 year bigger stints. Do you feel it's all gone by in a blaze and super quick, or is it starting to feel like a lengthy enough period?
It's a bit of both, I suppose, Joe. What strikes me is that how fortunate I was to finish up in journalism, because it sort of secured me continuous employment, you know. I've often thought of the other pursuits I could have gone with, and you'd finish up out of work or changing jobs or changing direction even. But it never crossed my mind to do that, you know.
You've seen extraordinary changes in life generally, but obviously within the industry. Like, it's worth a kind of juxtaposition that you have been tweeting away for the last decade on X. And yet you might tell people, for instance, when you were trying to get an article in the Daily Mail in the UK about your airport routine.
Oh, the occasion when there was a strike here.
Well, the occasion I'm getting at is when you had written up your piece and you needed to get it to the Daily Mail offices. You'd turn up,
Manchester, yeah.
You'd turn up at Dublin Airport and speak to a random person and slip him a few quid.
Well, the reason that was done was very simple. There was a post office strike where the way I would normally get my stuff from Dublin to Manchester was by teleprinter. And a girl called B. McMunn was the secretary in the office, and she would type out the stuff on the teleprinter and thereby get it to Manchester. But for some reason or other, all the links were closed down due to a strike, which meant that you couldn't make a phone call to England. You couldn't make a phone call anywhere. The teleprinter was down, and I was there sitting in the office, having done a piece of rugby as it happened, and wondering how in the name of God am I going to get this to Manchester? And there really was no way. I mean, carrier pigeon would have been, they're the sort of thoughts that would have crossed your mind, because there was no conceivable way of getting it that I could think of until it struck me, well, there are people going to Manchester today, this very afternoon. And one thought led to another, and eventually I got into my car, drove out to Dublin Airport and sat in a queue for the Manchester flight. And as is in the book, I picked out a suitable candidate, I thought, and he was a businessman, looked a business type of around 30. And I gave him a favour and told him I wanted him to asked him would he do me a favour. And he was very receptive. And I told him exactly. In fact, he became quite interested in the process. So the upshot of it was I wanted him to take my copy, which was folded up in an envelope. I gave him the fiver with that and explained to him that when he arrived in Manchester, would he go to the information desk and ring the Daily Mail from there and tell them that he had copy from Dermot Gilleece. And would they send a messenger out to the airport to pick it up? And that was it. Now, I didn't know what was happening because I'd no way of confirming with the desk that this is what I'd done until the following morning when I went down to my local newsagent, bought the paper, and there, sure enough, the stuff was in it. Yeah, it's amazing.
It's amazing. Email's easier. Your first visit to the Masters, just to give people some context of your career, was in 1989. At that stage, you'd been at the Irish Times 8 years. You were at every Open from 1980 to Shane Lowry's win at Portrush in 19.
Yeah.
The first time you took a laptop to a tournament was 92.
Yeah.
Muirfield, the Open. I've never asked you before, what was the sweet spot? What was the most enjoyable decade, give or take, to be covering golf? And I mean access to players, the quality of golf, deadlines.
It would have to be the noughties, really, because that was Harrington's time. And that was when we, as a nation, changed from being... from achieving moral victories to actually winning things.
I'm also asking, though, about your job, the golf writer's job. Say the noughties had not been a period of success for Ireland. Was there a period where you thought, do you know what?
The 90s was great.
90s?
Yeah, the 90s was great. I was getting the tail end of the Nicklaus era and Johnny Miller. People like that, they were just moving into senior ranks, and there were a great bunch of guys in Ireland golfers in Ireland at the time. I mean, fellas like Christy O'Connor Jr., Des Smith, Eamon Darcy, David Fearty, and they were good fun, and you could talk to them. And talking to guys nowadays, I had a long chat with Vincent Hogan of this parish at one point, and he was emphasising the huge change that had occurred, and it happened during my tenure, shall we say, and that was that access to sportsmen became almost non-existent, to the point nowadays, and it has to do a lot with the idea of money, I think. You have managers convincing players. I mean, they look at me, somebody like me, and all they see is PEST writ large across my forehead. Whereas before, I mean, you would get a smile, a welcoming smile from a guy, and how are you doing? You know, and what have you been at since we last chatted, or something like that, and you were a friend, that doesn't happen now, and it can't be a good thing. I mean, it happened as recently as the Irish Women's Open at Tremoland, when I was chatting to Leona Maguire. And Leona's a very receptive young woman. I mean, very helpful, wonderfully articulate, which is one of the reasons that you'd want to spend a little more time than normal with her. And I wanted to ask her something, and it was all terribly rushed. Her manager was there, and he was moving around and more or less orchestrating things and indicating that he wanted rid of us. And he did get rid of us. And I was a bit upset about this. But I went into to lunch immediately afterwards. And the next thing, he came to me and said that was I happy with everything with Leona? Now, she obviously, I put two and two together, she obviously said to him, you were a bit curt with so-and-so, you know, and I didn't like what happened, type of thing. Anyway, the upshot of it was I was offered further access to her, you know, but this was as an afterthought. And it sort of emphasised to me how sad the thing was. Leona clearly didn't want this to happen, but it happened because she allowed herself, I suppose, or she's just part of a system which operates that way.
if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump around here in all sorts of different ways, the way the book does. The book talks about the places you've seen, the characters you've come across, and it also weaves in the very personal as well. And if it's okay with you, I'll touch on this, but I'll only touch on it because in the book you only touch on it. But you do make the point in 1977 that you made a decision to stop drinking. And at that stage, you were in your late 30s. You had one child, married, another on the way. And you'd received a few warnings from the Mail at the time. And you include the Irish rugby coach, Sid Miller, had to abandon a press conference at Murrayfield because of what you say were your drunken interruptions.
Yes.
That sounds like a really...
That's about as accurate as I could make it.
Yeah.
So, it's exactly what happened.
That's kind of a difficult, horrible period to go through. I'm sure you didn't feel good about that the next morning.
Well, the next morning, I think that was probably it would have been on the Saturday. And the following day, I finished up in St. Patrick's Hospital. I don't know whether I was running for cover or whether I realised that the game was up type of thing. But it's something that was very wrong of me in that my colleagues turned to me. Now, my memory of it is not great, but my colleagues turned to me as much to say, you really messed things up badly there today for us. They weren't too fussed about me. They'd probably seen enough of me at that stage. But the one that came through really with flying colours from the whole episode was Sid Miller. I spent some time in St. Patrick's Hospital from that particular trip, and it was the only time I was hospitalised for drink, and it wasn't a very exciting period in any sense, in that all they do in these psychiatric hospitals, drink-wise, is they stop you drinking. So they give you, ideally, I suppose it gives you time for reflection. But I had been in touch with the Mail in Manchester as well, and they flew me to Manchester, and so that I could meet with the editor. And he locked the door of his office for about an hour, and I got the full treatment. And the essence of what he was saying to me was, look, this is a fairly big organisation, and we've got an awful lot of problems on our hands, and most of them at that time would have been financial. These were the winters of discontent in Britain, and the last thing I want is an Irish correspondent who's acting the maggot, as it were. But they were very good to me. I mean, and I have to say, particularly the sports editor, Brian Webster, who sadly has gone from us, he was wonderful in that, wonderfully caring. And he probably saved my career in that he was prepared to listen to me, and he sort of sensed what I was going through. And it was a very difficult time for everybody involved, obviously my wife and my family. And anyway, but when I came back, one of the first things I did was I said, I'm going to have to apologise to Sid Miller. And I remember it was Anglesey Road, and that's where the Irish training used to happen at that time. And as luck would have it, he was on one side of the pitch and I was on the other, and I had to walk. I remember deciding, this is it. This is my moment. And I walked across the pitch, and you can imagine, like, it was not the nicest walk I've ever made, in that every step I felt was taking me closer to, well, dare I say, a confrontation, which I didn't want. Anyway, I went up to Miller, who was really a lovely man, totally at variance with the tough prop forward that we would have associated him with. But I went over to him and I said to him, if you don't mind, I owe you an apology. And he looked at me, and it's amazing that I still remember it vividly. He looked at me, and there was an understanding look about him, that feeling about him, that, come on, spill it out. What's the problem? Knowing full well what the problem was. And I explained to him that I'd behaved very badly at Murrayfield and that I was very sorry that I'd done this. And he said, have you done anything about it? And I said I had. And I'd been hospitalised since. But that was it. With Mike Gibson, who was another one that I treated. Funny, we were talking earlier about access to players. I mean, it's amazing when I look back on it, Joe, that Rugby Internationals at Lansdowne Road, the Wanderers Pavilion was set up for the media. I think it was the Wanderers Pavilion, one at the far end. Mm. And we used to just walk in there after a match and sit down in the dressing room beside the players. And I remember having a big awkward tape machine with me, and I'm talking to Gibson and getting stuff from him. This is when I was with the Daily Mail. And the access we had was extraordinary. It was excessive, really, because it allowed idiots like me to do what I did. And I gave people like Mike Gibson a hard time. And there were other situations in which journalists challenged the Irish place kicker. I remember Tom Kiernan at the time was challenged to go out on the pitch and have a place kicking competition with a member of the press because he had missed a couple of shots of goal that afternoon. Like, the thing was ludicrous, really, the access. It shows you, like, that there are two sides to this thing, that you've got to sometimes you've got to protect journalists from themselves. But anyway, I would have overdone things with Gibson and been excessively aggressive in asking him questions after a match or something like that. But it was some years later. In fact, it was probably only about 10 years ago. I was up at Lough Erne Golf Resort at a Pro-Am, and I played with Pat Jennings that day, actually. It was a very enjoyable day. And afterwards, I happened to meet Mike Gibson. And I said to him, and this was about, God, what are we talking about? We're talking about 30 years after the event, I said to him, I owe you an apology. And I laughed afterwards, He said to me, I don't have any marks, Dermot, that I can see, But people were very kind, I have to say, Joe, People were very, and I mean colleagues. Peter Byrne, sadly, who's gone from us, he was a wonderful colleague, and he got me out of more scrapes than I care to think about. And it was so important, really, now that I look back on it, because you were talking about a person's career. I mean, the whole thing could have gone down the tubes if people hadn't got me out of trouble. Mm. And fortunately, I met up with people, and Dave Guiney was one of them, and who had been down a similar road, and their kindness in giving me of their time and understanding. And I decided, I knew the end was coming early in 1977. I don't know why, but I sensed that the game was up. And I went off drink for 1 or 2 months, and then I went back on it again. But I remember distinctly, it was a Whit weekend. It was a Tuesday morning after a Whit weekend, which had been a fairly rough one. I had been at the East of Ireland Golf Championship in Baltray, covering for the Mail. And I remember waking up on a Tuesday morning and saying to myself, this is it. No more. Whatever it costs, no more. And I got help from other sources, and thank God that was it.
You, I was going to text you when I read this line. Around that same period, so 1970s, you're into your 30s now. You say, at this stage, I suppose my general attitude could have been characterised as somewhat arrogant. I saw myself as being remarkably gifted at what I did. I was going to text you and say, when did that change? I must have missed that.
Well, yeah, that's pretty normal for a heavy drinker, you know.
Okay, so you linked the two.
Oh, yeah, there's no question that most heavy drinkers are of the view that they run the world, really, that everybody else is out of step except them. And I genuinely believe that, you know, that I'm surrounded by gobshites, and what am I going to do, you know? No wonder I'm drinking. And, you know, there's sort of... you particularly attribute those things to anybody in authority.
Okay. You, I find it
I'm surprised you didn't.
Well, no, I just thought it was a general regard for yourself. No.
Well, it was what I'd become.
Okay.
Basically, I hopefully I changed.
I'm sure you did. You do, and I find it very interesting, and anyone with an interest in journalism, I think, will as well. You do give a very thoughtful breakdown of the business of writing. So to briefly surmise, you don't class yourself as like a gifted creative writer. You're more of a tradesman, more of a Harrington than a Christy Senior, we'll say.
Exactly.
And you talk about there is almost, and you say you were good at maths when you were in school, there is a mathematics almost, a structure. And then there is a skill to how sentences are written. Long sentences, as in over 40 words, you tended to avoid. But you liken good writing almost to music. And you talk about in great music there being just a basic melody. And then grace notes are added in for a sense of rhythm or to make things interesting. And you say, I believe writing is the same. It's all about facilitating the reader experience. And you point as an example to just a piece from the 1996 Olympics, the opening of the Games. Patrick Collins wrote the piece. And it's that moment where Muhammad Ali so famously and emotionally emerges to light the torch, and is an amazing moment and remains an amazing moment. And so the excerpt you pick out to illustrate your point goes as follows. The sporting summer had run its crowded course, and its images scurry by like the leaves of autumn. Yet that single image, he's talking about Ali, that single image remains as sharp and as poignant as it did on a July evening in Dixie. And you say, it'd be possible to cut that sentence in half and retain its meaning, but then it's not good writing. So I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed you explaining the craft as it was. But for you, it was a craft. It was chiseled out. It's not just like, hey, let's open the laptop and let's see what my fingers just happen to patter out. It's all very planned and chiseled.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was pleased with that. I was afraid of it, Joe, because I thought it might sound pompous, you know, to be, dare I say, telling people how to write. What I was telling people was how I write. And I wouldn't. I mean, Collins, I read voraciously. I mean, anything he ever read or ever wrote, and I thought he was a wonderful journalist, terrific writer. He wrote on a Sunday. He used to write for the News of the World, and then he finished up with the Mail on Sunday. And what fascinated me about him was that he would take a subject that had arisen during the previous week, which a lot of Sunday writers would do, and he would tease it out and give his spin on it. But it was always accompanied by a very obvious research, a huge amount of research. And you knew that he had really dug into it to come up with certain facts. And that's what made the thing so interesting, particularly for me. You know, I love the idea of, let me put it another way, I hate the idea of somebody assuming that, of treating their readers poorly. I mean, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. That not having enough respect for the reading public, you know, because most of the people who read, we're a very sports conscious nation, and we really are interested in our writers. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, my parents got the Independent at home, and John D. Hickey and the various other writers of the time. They were gods, really, certainly in my house as far as I was concerned. And I read voraciously anything that they wrote. And I loved the idea of putting thought and effort into something, you know, rather than, because I've seen both sides, we all do. And the dismissive attitude of some people, some journalists, we'll get rid of this like in jig time. And I saw a lot of that, and I didn't like it.
Yeah. Your command of the language was obvious for everybody to see. So that's leave insert education and off you go.
That was it. The Christian Brothers, and I went to Joey's in Fairview, you know, they've come in for a lot of stick. And quite a lot of it is justified. I mean, the violence that I now, if I think about it, that I witnessed was something that we shouldn't have been subjected to. There's no question about it. As far as education was concerned, they had this system, and it was common to all of them, all of the brothers really, that you hammered something in the belief, in the hope that it would stick. And if it stuck, you would be able to pass the leaving cert. And remember, they were dealing with working class guys largely. And I remember one teacher saying that the leaving cert is not the be-all and end-all of education. But he said to us, if you don't have it, you've nothing. And he was right, really. You know, it opened doors. I mean, I'm talking about the 50s, where it opened doors to the civil service, to ESB, Aer Lingus, Bank, various other jobs like that. Because university wasn't an option, really. There were going to be very few members of our class. Some of them did, actually, and did very well. But generally speaking, that wasn't going to happen. So they believed, as I say, in Duco, hammer in, not a Duco, not lead out. And it worked for me. And what surprised me, John, it's in the book, was when I arrived in London, there was a national printer strike here in 1964, and I opted to accept the protective notice we received from the management of the Irish Press. I opted to accept it as severance, really. So I went to London, and I was arrogant enough to believe like that I would survive there, you know, that I was good enough. And I worked in a place called Haters, and I was surprised that the standard of my English, as I was producing for the Irish Press, was good enough. Not only good enough, but it was actually pretty well up there with anything they had to offer. And that surprised me. It also gave me tremendous encouragement to really commit myself to a career in journalism, because there were still options, I suppose, at that stage.
We'll continue to jump around. Greg Norman is in the news this week because the inevitable has happened and Liv have decided you're no longer our CEO. Greg, thanks for all the memories. He has had a remarkable effect on the game, though, when you think, if nothing else, about Liv. There's a random passage where you touch on Norman, and you say in the course of a press conference at the Donahill Cup at St Andrews that he returned to his favourite subject, which is money. And he gets personal with the media. I hadn't read this story before or heard you tell it. Norman starts asking, and you're amongst them, the journalists, well, how much do you earn?
Yeah.
And Mark Garrett of the Press Association is the only one who's not suitably chastened enough to say, well, this is what I earn.
Yeah.
And Norman, I'm assuming with a sense of derision, says, people in my office are being paid more than that. As in people in my office, they're lowest of the low almost. They're being paid more than that. That doesn't reflect well on Norman. Your impressions of him, complex person?
That's exactly it, Joe. You've hit the nail on the head, complex person. Because there was one thing that Greg Norman did, which I admire above all other sportsmen that I've met. And I don't say that lightly.
God, I can't even think what you're going to say here. Above all other sports people?
Yes.
Okay, go on.
Yes. I cannot imagine, possibly Harrington might have done this, but I can't imagine anybody else that I know who would have done it. And that was the aftermath of 1996 of the Masters, when he was absolutely humiliated by Faldo. Now, the situation was, the media speculation was, will he come into us? Will he talk to us? Will he confront us?
Yeah.
And the general, I cannot think of anybody who would have said, oh, of course he will, yeah, sure, he has to, it's the Masters.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't remember, I'm sure everyone does, but he had surrendered a 6-shot overnight lead to Faldo and played terribly on the Sunday, and the Masters was his great Everest. So...
And well, I don't use the word humiliated lightly, but to concede a 6-shot lead, and he was hammered, really. He did a 78, I think, to Faldo's 67.
Was it 78?
Yeah. Oof. And it was just, it was the ultimate, really, in choking, if you want. And the Americans love that phrase. I don't. But anyway, we sat there in the media centre, and as I say, the speculation generally was, no, he wouldn't be able to. And bang on cue, Greg walked in and sat down and confronted us. And his first words were, I played shit. I remembered those distinctly. I played shit. And that was enough to break the silence. Here we had a relatively recent world number one to say something like that about a tournament round. And he went on from there, and he put it down to poor thinking, and that it wasn't really a golfing problem. That I forget exactly what he said. It didn't really matter, Joe. It was his presence there. And he didn't sort of offer us a few words and then run. If I remember correctly, he gave us a good 10, 15 minutes. And I was hugely impressed with that.
And how do you reconcile that with what he's become?
Well, you've just described him as a very complex man, and that probably illustrates it better than anything. I really don't know what made Norman tick. I wrote it on occasions when it was appropriate that he was one of the most cooperative, helpful sportsmen you could ever meet. I tried to interview him, and I did interview him on a number of occasions. In fact, I went out to Dubai the following year after that Masters collapse, and he gave me a wonderful interview, very straightforward, explaining what had happened and how he had been since then. And it was all, now, whether it could have been hypocritical, he could have been winding me up, I don't know. But it just went beyond what I'd come to expect from sportsmen at that time. Nicklaus wouldn't have done that, in my view. Nicklaus he'd have been courteous and that'd be it. You would have got a couple of minutes and that would be an end to it. But I've always felt that he was one of the most helpful guys that I ever met on tour. Now, I often, if somebody asked me what I think of Norman, I said, you go to talk to him and you might get 3 minutes, you might get 30 minutes, but you would get time. And I knew that I wasn't that important in Norman's life, which was, again, a measure of the man. And I would go up and ask him for an interview to chat about something in particular. And as I say, I might get 3 minutes, might get 30. I actually played golf with him as one of his partners down in Doonbeg at the press opening of Doonbeg in 2002. And he couldn't have been more pleasant, you know. Now, against that, he became obsessed with money. I mean, I remember another Masters press conference, I think it was probably the early noughties, when we had the word on of that particular week about Norman was that he had sold his interest in Cobra Golf for $42 million. And somebody asked Nicklaus, who came in for interview, what do you think of Greg's latest business deal, you know? And I mean, Nicklaus couldn't believe it when he heard 42 million, you know, because Nicklaus was struggling at the time.
Yeah.
And he couldn't believe that Norman had pulled such a stroke. But I think, Joe, I couldn't go beyond what you suggested, that he's a very complex man. And he probably became more interested in money than he might have been, you know. But I think deep down, there was a tremendous honesty about him.
He has something in common with one of our great players in that a drive down Magnolia Lane for him is not overly pleasant, I would think. And so that brings in McIlroy. I guess the key difference is McIlroy's not done yet. The interesting thing about Rory's career is it's so genuinely open to these wildly different interpretations. If we were like debating society and the two arguments were his career has been a great disappointment or his career has been a stunning success, I'd argue either case and fancy my chances. I think you could argue either case. Where are you on Rory and Augusta and how this story is going to end?
I have to be careful here, Joe, because I've found people have been asking me similar questions in recent times. And I think I've been probably overly cruel when it comes to Rory. I mean, it's very difficult for me to explain exactly what I mean when somebody asks me what I think of Rory. I mean, because I first saw him as a 13-year-old at Portmarnock, hitting a golf shot for Darren Clark in his foundation in 22, I think it was.
Clark still talks about that.
Does he? Yeah.
Hey, Darren, there's a new kid, you got to see him. He's like, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Then he saw him.
Wheel him out. Yeah. He turned to me and after, first of all, what he said to Rory was, Rory, come on, Rory, show us what you got. Which was a sort of a standard command by Clark to his minions. But anyway, Rory, it was the seventh hole of par 3. And he hit the most glorious 7-iron, I think it was, to about 5 or 6 feet. Now, having said that, at the time, I didn't really think much of Rory as a prospect. What he was doing was extraordinary at his age, admittedly, but he was so small. I mean, he really was tiny. And you couldn't see him being physically big enough, unless he became another Ian Woosnam or something like that. But everything you thought about Rory had to be tempered by that, by the limitations of his physique. But I've said this before. I believe that when players are hugely gifted as teenagers, it is extremely difficult for them to progress in the normal way. For instance, Harrington is probably the best example of a player who squeezed every last bit talent out of his career that he could have done by dint of hard work. The hugely talented ones like Greg Norman or Tom Weiskopf was the one who really highlighted better than anybody. The really talented ones don't really bother when they get to a certain point. And then comes the surprise that I can't do this anymore. I can't dominate like I did as a teenager. What's gone wrong? Ernie Els was a very good example of that. I mean, what happened to him was Tiger Woods. And he was absolutely stunned on the assumption that having dominated everything as a teenager, he could have been a tennis international, a rugby international. He could have done anything. He comes along, wins. He won at Wingfoot 93, I think it was. He won the US Open. He was 22, early 20s. And everything is so promising. I mean, we're wondering how many majors is this guy going to win? And then Woods comes along and effectively destroys him. And he knew this, and the worst of all was that he actually said it publicly. In 2000, when Woods won the US Open by 15 shots, I mean, he more or less said, this is unfair.
He said, I won the tournament I was in.
Yeah. And for a fella of Els's talent, now we'll come back to Rory, there are ways of winning. Now, I think I was reading a paper recently about Tommy Fleetwood made the point about Rory, that Rory is unquestionably the most talented golfer of his generation. And I wouldn't argue with that. But the question, Joe, is what do you mean by talent? There are various levels of talent. There's the talent to be able to hit golf shots, to be able to drive the ball better than anybody else in the world. And then there's the talent that Scottie Scheffler has to score, to win tournaments, almost at will. I mean, you look at anything nowadays and you look at the leaderboard on television and you're amazed if Scheffler is not there in the top three. And it's very easy to pick holes in Scheffler's game and say that he's nowhere near as talented a player as Rory is, and that's probably true, technically. And that's what Fleetwood means. Most golfers, they look at each other and they're always looking for the magic. You know, what does this guy have that I can learn from and become a better player? And they walk up and down the practice grounds. You see them at tournaments. And they see things and they look at other players and they look at Rory and all they see is just this glorious talent. But they don't play with him often enough to see the weaknesses as well. The weaknesses in Rory's game when it comes to scoring or when it comes to thinking clearly on a golf course. And his body language, you look at him on television, that's all I can do nowadays. I look at him on television, you can almost tell in advance how he's going to perform by his body language. You know, there's a sort of the shoulders sag and he just looks as if, well, this isn't my day type of thing. You never got that impression from the great ones, from Woods or from Nicklaus or from any of these guys. I mean, Nicklaus, I remember Tom Watson saying that he was talking about Nicklaus and he said, there are better drivers of the golf ball. There are better long iron players. There are better putters. But he said nobody, and I mean nobody, knows how to manage his game around the golf course as good as Nicklaus can. And that was the difference as far as Watson was concerned. And game management, I suppose, is at the nub of it. I mean, the pressure that's going to be on Rory to win that Masters when it does come around. I'd like to think it will. I don't know, and that's the truth, Joe. I don't know. I'd like to think it will. But I keep thinking of 2001 at Augusta, and Woods is playing for the Tiger Slam. Now, Rory's going to have reasonably another 7 or 8 decent goes at winning the Masters. In 2001, Woods arrived at Augusta, and this was the one. He knew deep down that the chances of him going to Augusta with 3 other majors under his belt were slim to nil. And to tee it up in those circumstances and then to win, which he did, that's a measure of handling pressure, of making things happen.
You have a line from Nicklaus in the book. When he was at his peak, he was asked how confident he was going into tournaments. And he said, I looked down the range and I thought, I'm better than all of these guys. And I also knew all of these guys knew I was better than them. And I thought that was applicable to Woods as well.
Yes.
Woods or Nicklaus? Your life depends on it.
My life depends on it.
On a Sunday. They're level in the same grouping going out at course of your choice.
I think it would have to be Nicklaus.
What? That's the wrong answer, I'm afraid. Go on.
I think it would have to be Nicklaus because he was so predictable, really, you know. And Woods, even at his peak, Woods was not predictable. I mean, remember, like, Nicklaus won 18 majors, but he also was runner-up in 19 of them, you know, which is unreal.
Yeah, just as impressive, really.
It's he had this. This is what we're talking about, really, when we're talking about the X factor with Rory. Nicklaus had this X factor that he could apply himself to winning something, you know, and. He thought so well. I mean, if you look at the US Open last summer, when Rory had the chance at Pinehurst, and, you know, I couldn't imagine Nicklaus doing what Rory did on the 72nd. What I mean is I couldn't imagine him overshooting the flag and leaving himself with a downhill putt for the title. If anything, he was going to be comfortably short. That sort of technical talent is what separated Nicklaus from the rest, in my view. He was the best competitor, I believe, the game has ever seen. He wasn't the best golfer. Woods was a better golfer. But terms of if you want your house on something and you want somebody to deliver under the cosh. Because the great thing, the great talent Nicklaus, and I imagine Woods probably had it as well, was that there was no fear of winning. You know, there was no winning for Nicklaus was his raison d'etre. You know, give it to me. Yeah. Let it happen. And, you know, he said to me on one occasion, and I was asking him, Harrington believed, like, that with all the runners-up positions he had, I think Harrington had 32 runners-up in tournaments. He said, like, that a certain percentage of them were thrown away by him. Others, some of the others... the other player was just better on the day, and he admitted that there were other occasions still when he choked. I asked Nicklaus, and he said, as far as he could figure, there were only two occasions when he threw away the possibility of a win, and significant. And one was the Open at Lytham when Bob Charles won 63. I think it was 63, yeah. Well, anyway, Nicklaus, he bogeyed the last 3 holes and missed a playoff by a shot. And that to him was unforgivable.
Right.
I forget what the other one was, but I mean, it gives you an idea that he didn't see himself as somebody who tended to throw away.
I think it's reassuring that at 84 you forgot something, because for God's sake, that you remember in 1963 he bogeyed the last 3 is impressive enough. There's a great passage to again, I guess, capture the changes in the game, where you bring along 2 of Christy Senior's clubs.
Oh, yeah.
From the 1973 Ryder Cup. So permission driver McGregor and Fred Smith 3-iron. And you put them in the very capable hands of Noel Fox, who people know, obviously, and say, hit away, talk to me. And he has a good point. He doesn't find a huge difference, by the way, in distance.
No, that was really interesting.
Isn't it just? Yeah, he's like, the ball is the big change in distance, not necessarily the clubs. But he had a good point about the sweet spot and the forgiveness. And he said maybe with the modern day driver, the sweet spot might be a €2 coin.
Yeah.
And with these Christy Senior clubs, it's more of a 5-cent coin, which brought home the point. Which goes to show what a phenomenal ball striker Christy Senior must have been. He passed away in 2016. Again, I think anyone who's still with us this stage into the podcast is a golf fan. They will know that during the 50s and the 60s on the British and Irish circuit, he was a dominant player, 10 Ryder Cup appearances, his partnership with Peter Allis, well known. Played 26 times at the British Open, the only major he played in, and he had 10 top 10 finishes, runner-up in 65, behind Peter Thompson. Thompson said if he'd won one, he would have had several more. I had wondered, and I think I know the answer to this, but I always remember Nicklaus, maybe it was around the time of his Hall of Fame speech, or certainly in latter years, would say, yeah, Christy was a very good player. And I thought, is he damning him there with faint praise? Like we have Christy there as a legend, and here's Jack going, no, Christy was a good player, and I'm sure he meant it well. But I always thought, But then I do see footage of Christy O'Connor swinging a club senior, and it is special. Like, it's not just Irish eyes here. You're well placed to talk about him, but he was special, despite Jack kind of saying, he was a good player.
Yeah, I asked Jack direct question. No, what happened was that Shea Smith did a book himself on Christy. I think it was about 92, I think. And he asked me if I would get Nicklaus to do the foreword for it. And I met Nicklaus in Augusta. And I went to him and I explained to him what I needed, and he was very amenable. And I said, well, I tell you what, Jack, I'll ask you a few questions and I'll write down and I'll pad it out then, and that's the way we'll do it. I didn't want to bother him. So I said, we can start with saying you're saying that Christy was a great player. And he stopped me. He said, no, Christy was a good player. He was a great friend. He was a good player. No, he said, let's move on. And I admired that in that his use of language, Nicklaus was very precise in his use of language. You had to win a major to be great.
That's what I read into that.
Yeah. That was he was very clear about that. And you didn't qualify as a great player. Joe Carr was a great player because he won 3 British Amateurs, which Nicklaus would consider majors. And he said that Christy was great. But I always felt about Christy, Jimmy Kinsler was interesting. I talked to Jimmy recently about Christy. He spent 2 hours in Christy's bedroom shortly before Christy died. And funnily enough, they talked about a caddy. He talked about a caddy called Shamey from Megham in Surrey. who had caddied for Christy in the famous John Player Classic win. And we're talking about the percentage Shamey would have got of the 25,000. You know, he should have got $2,500. Christy miscalculated, and he sort of indicated that he had shortchanged Shamey, which Jimmy said would never have happened, but his memory was failing him. But Jimmy reckoned that Christy never applied himself to the Open as a major event in his life, as he should have done. He said he treated it as a just run-of-the-mill tournament. Now, he often said to me that for him it was no more than a pension, that there was no great money in it, Joe, at that stage. I have my own theory, and my own theory is that Christy was a product of what I would describe as a village mentality. He was a simple man who came from a village outside Galway City, and he didn't want all the baggage that would go with winning the Open Championship.
It's the Harry Bradshaw theory.
Yeah, he would. No, the Brad would have won it. The Brad wasn't.
No, but Bradshaw said that about Senior as well.
Yeah.
That he knew if he won a major, it might change his life, and
yeah.
he was happy in his life.
Yeah, and he didn't want that. I often think of Philip Walton, who Philip is not a product of Malahide. Philip is a product of the hill in Malahide, which is an enclave in which he and the Craddocks and various other families lived. But it was very much a village to Philip, you know, that, and when he moved outside of it, I don't know if he felt comfortable. And Christy really enjoyed playing Britain and Ireland. He was very well liked in Britain. Really, they loved him over there. And I don't know if it would have suited him. I mean, he had loads of opportunities to go to the States, and I know people.
I was just checking this morning. Would you think this is true? Like, it's on his Wikipedia. It says he turned down 26 Masters invitations.
Well, you can count them whatever way you like, Joe. I know that he played his first Ryder Cup in 55. And every year he was an automatic invitee to Augusta from that point onwards.
Okay.
Now, he played his last Ryder Cup in 73. So, and that was 10. So there were 20 years. Okay, so certainly for 20 years.
Give or take. And why not, why not go to the Masters once?
Well, you see, he didn't consider, Christy looked on tournament golf like as effectively his livelihood. And he said to me that if I could have organised, or if they had organised for me a couple of tournaments around the Masters where he could have paid, he could have made it work. Now, I'm not saying that he couldn't afford to go to Augusta. He could have, but it didn't make financial sense to him.
And you obviously knew him in his later years, living in Clontarf, Royal Dublin. You know, he was just omnipresent. As he sat there, you know, through the 2000s and watched Masters after Masters and the glory of it on TV, did he ever express a big regret that he hadn't gone at least once?
Yes, he told me, he said I should have played the Masters.
Yeah.
He didn't say that he'd like to have won it or anything like that, but it was the sort of golf course that would have suited Christy anyway, because the great challenge of Augusta is that you're going to miss greens, and getting up and down or hitting it to the right spot on the green, which is going to give you a reasonable chance. But there would have been scare stories from there as well. I mean, Peter Allis played there in the 60s and had 5 putts on one occasion, you know, on one green. And I've no doubt Alice would have told him, for Jesus' sake, Christy, you don't want to be going near that place. You know, and there were scare stories, I've no doubt, emanating from Augusta, because the greens were different. They weren't bent grass greens that they are now, but they were still very quick, mainly because of the undulations.
Yeah.
But the thing that I remember most about Christy, really, in terms of talent, two things. One was a story from Tommy Murphy, who was an assistant of Royal Dublin, Sligo man. He later became pro at Forest Little and then emigrated to France. Anyway, Tommy was telling me that Tommy was a fit young man in his mid-20s at this stage as an assistant to Christy. And he went out to the garden in Royal Dublin on a particularly bleak day, and he starts hitting shots into an east wind off the sea. And he's jumping out of his shoelaces. Now, Tommy wasn't lacking length, but he's jumping out of his shoelaces at these things, and the ball was going nowhere in relative terms. He was hitting at about 220, 230 into a pretty stiff wind. And next thing, Christy comes up and he throws out a few balls beside Tommy.
What age is Christy at this stage?
Christy at this stage would have been late 50s.
Right.
And he throws down a few balls and starts firing them out there, you see. And they're only going about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, you see. And they're going out about 20 yards beyond Tommy's best. And Tommy's looking at this, and then he stops. And he turns to Christy, and he said to Christy, "What are you hitting?" And Christy said, "I'm hitting a 4-wood." And Tommy said, "You're what?" He said, "You're hitting a 4." But he said, you're... And Christy said, yeah. He said, I have to keep it low into that wind. He said, "I'm hitting halfway up the ball."
Wow.
And I told that to pros, and I've told it to leading amateurs. And in fact, I told it as recently as a couple of weeks ago to Barry Redden, who was a very fine amateur. And I said to Barry, "Did you ever try and hit halfway up the ball?" And he said, "Why do you ask?" I said, "Well, that's the way Christy used to do it into the wind." He said, "I know." He said, "I tried it a few times." He said, "Disastrous."
Yeah. Wow.
But it was something that great ball strikers would have believed was the way to go if you wanted to control a ball into a firm breeze. The other occasion, as I say, was in 2002. It was prior to the Ryder Cup at the Belfry, and John Jacobs, and I make mention of it in the book. John Jacobs, the members of the 55 team, the surviving members of the 55 Ryder Cup team were there. And Christy was in his late 70s at that stage. 1924, 2000, he'd have been 75, 76. Anyway, Jacobs was looking at him. And now Jacobs was acknowledged as technically one of the finest teachers in the world at that stage. He was called Dr. Golf.
Yeah.
And he said, "I know Christy talks about he hates to be talked of as a natural player. But he said, when I look at him, he said, I just marvel at how good that swing is." He said, "I've never seen anything to compare with it." Now, this is a man who was a Ryder Cup player himself, and I mean, who obviously saw a lot of good players over the years. But that was his opinion. I wouldn't question that in any sense, you know. Tony Jacklin used to talk about Christy's piccolo grip and stuff like that. But I really don't care, Joe, you know, because what he could do with the golf ball was such that somebody like me, who's simply an observer, and I wouldn't have the talent to know, to be able to judge how good he was.
I presume you were there in '66 for the 2-3-3 finish.
No, I wasn't.
You weren't?
No, I would have been covered in soccer or rugby at that time. I wasn't
gallivanting.
I wasn't covering golf at that stage.
Let's finish, because we've been talking for over an hour here. That's enough.
That's your fault.
It just, I didn't want to start with them or spend too much time on them because we've talked about them before. But I guess if we're talking about a farewell to the fairways, you can't not touch on the likes of Harrington and McGinley in particular. Harrington has written the foreword for the book. I was at your book launch at Clontarf Golf Club. Paul McGinley shows up, has read passages of the book, reads them aloud. From the same school, out in the water there. They're emblematic of when you say the Irish golfers, they are a pretty special bunch in many ways. You kind of, I'd say you and your heart of hearts have them near enough top of your beloved. They're kind of special pair.
Ah, yeah. They're very nice guys, and they're very caring guys. You know, they really are. I mean, Harrington, like, I was trying to figure out ways to do a book and put a package, shall we say, together that would be acceptable to the public. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great now if we could get Harrington to do the foreword? And I contacted Caroline, which is always my route to Padraig, his wife.
Right. I go through his agent, but that's fair enough.
So I contacted Caroline and I said, I'm thinking of doing a book. This would have been about last June. I'm thinking of doing a book, and it'd be great, like, if I could get Padraig to do the foreword. You know, I'm really clutching at straws here. And she said, leave it with me. And about a week later, I got a phone call. I was talking to Padraig, and I was telling him what you wanted him to do. And he said it would be an honour. Oh, Jesus, that nearly blew me away, Joe. You know, the idea of Harrington. Busy, but, you know, a great lover of the game and a great admirer of the game at all levels, that he would have thought enough of me to react that way. And then we had the procedure then of actually getting him to do it. And I was on to Adrian Mitchell, his manager, and I said to Adrian, look, it's very simple. I'll make a phone call to Padraig, a few minutes chatting to him, and I'll flam up a nice forward for the book. And he said, no, Padraig wants to do this one himself. Which meant that it was 500 words, which he actually carved out himself, wrote himself. And it was done in July, which was not an easy time for him between the Open and the Senior Open and various other things he was involved in. But he insisted on doing it. And I thought I was putting him under the cosh. And the last thing I would have wanted was to upset him, like, in any sense. But he did it. And I was so grateful. It was a lovely thing to do. And then McGinley was almost the very same. I asked McGill, any chance you'd be available to launch this book of mine? And Paul said, well, I'm going to be in Dublin on A, B, C and D, and gave me certain dates. And I picked one. I said, does this suit? He said, it does. I'll be there. And that was it. You know, and you were there, Joe, and you heard him, and, like, he really did go over the top in terms of things, the nice things he said. But
oh, I thought so.
Yeah, what came across to me, like, more than anything was that I felt part of his life. I felt like I had been part of his life. In the way he referred to me, because I met his dad, and you did a beautiful job on his dad, I have to say. And Mick was a great character, is a great character, and that's just it. The whole thing was really nice.
Good. A life well lived. Happy with the book, happy with your career choice, happy with how it all went?
Well, I mean, how could I not be happy given the mess I made at early stages of my career? the pursuit I chose, given that it gave me 63 years of work as a journalist, which I could never have imagined.
63 years of work you enjoyed, though, because journalism is full of people who do not enjoy.
Well, that's it,
their work.
And but look how blessed I was, Joe, in that it allowed me to work right into my 80s, and how many people, although I sometimes think, that we overlook artists, actors, people like that, who work into their 80s and 90s, and we don't marvel at them, really, sure, he's still, Ridley Scott, he's done this latest film, and he's 86 now, and we don't marvel at that, I suppose, but I feel very fortunate that I've had such a long career. People have been good to me, and I'd like to think that they got value for money along the way.
Well, the book is called Farewell to the Fairways. Dermot Gilleece, great to have you in. Good to catch you up, and best of luck with everything.
Thanks very much, Joe.